Negotiators for the United States and Iran appear to have reached a tentative agreement in the now 3-month-long war, but U.S. sources tell MS Now President Trump hasn't signed off on it yet. If the president does agree to this draft memorandum, though, the sources say it would extend the ceasefire for 60 days and kick off a new round of talks on Iran's nuclear program. The U.S. sources add that during the extension of the truce, shipping through the Strait of Hormuz would be unrestricted. Iran would have to remove all mines from the strait within 30 days. The U.S. naval blockade would be lifted in proportion to the restoration of commercial shipping, and the U.S. would issue some sanctions waivers to allow Iran to sell oil. The nuclear issue, of course, would remain unsolved. But U.S. sources tell MS Now the first sticking point to be negotiated would be the disposal of Iran's highly enriched uranium and the country's enrichment program. The sources add the possible deal would also end the war between Israel and the Iran-backed Hezbollah in Lebanon, where thousands have been killed and forcibly displaced by Israeli bombardment. Vice President J.D. Vance was asked about where this situation stands just yesterday.
Well, I think it's hard to say exactly when or if the president's going to sign the MOU. We're going back and forth on a couple of language points. I do think that we've made a lot of progress here. It's very clear that I think the Iranians, they want a deal, and they want to open the Straits of Hormuz. We want them to open the Straits of Hormuz. There are a couple of issues on the nuclear stuff, the highly enriched stockpile, and also the question of enrichment. So, we're going back and forth with them. We do think they're negotiating, at least so far, in good faith, and we're making some progress. Hopefully, we'll continue to make progress. The president will be in a position where he can endorse the agreement, but obviously, that's still TBD. I can't guarantee that we're going to get there, but right now I feel pretty good about it.
A big TBD, but optimism nonetheless from the vice president. The president, for his part, didn't speak to reporters on camera yesterday, but Fox News is promoting an interview he did with his daughter-in-law, Lara Trump, which will air tomorrow. The president was asked what line Iran would have to cross for the U.S. military to restart offensive strikes. He defended the war despite its possible impact on the Republican Party this fall as well.
Well, a deal that wasn't going to be good for us is the line, ultimately, because, I'm playing it out and we're going to see. And that's what I do. I negotiate. They negotiate. They're very good negotiators. They're crafty. But in the end, we have all the cards because we've defeated them militarily. Look, they have no Navy. Every ship, they have 159 ships. Every one of them are at the bottom of the sea. Every single one. We take pictures of them. We have people going down taking pictures of hundreds of ships.
You have consistently been willing to do the hard things, the things that your predecessor said should have been done, but they didn't have the guts to do them.
So you have really a very small window. So if you wanted to play that game, then you would wait till the midterms are over, and then the following hour, you'll attack Iran because they cannot have a nuclear weapon. Most people agree with me on that. But then it gets maybe carried into, the next election, whether it's a midterm or not. So you have a very short window for doing anything having to do with war. But I don't view that window. I view it, I have to do what's right.
A lot for us to dig into with White House correspondent for The Hill, Julia Manchester. Julia, do we even have an understanding of if the president thinks that this is a good deal? The vice president seems optimistic about it, but what were the goals that they were trying to achieve, if not to tackle the nuclear question?
Yeah, we don't have an understanding yet. We know that U.S. and Iranian negotiators have agreed to the deal, but this is really up to leadership in Iran and the United States to sign off on. And President Trump, as of now, has not signed off on that deal. I think for the administration, the nuclear question is huge. You hear the president reiterating that he does not want Iran to have access to a nuclear weapon. And I think there's a lot of pressure on the administration to make sure this is a stronger deal in their, as they would view it, than the JCPOA or the 2015 Obama administration deal with Iran. So right now, very unclear as to what happens next. And in that pre-taped interview, President Trump really not giving too much information as to whether he approves it.
And yet we'll have a sense, apparently, on Saturday morning if he says anything more about this issue. I think also innate in that interview that he was doing with Lara Trump is the idea that he knows the politics of this war is not good. That does fly in the face of other comments he's made where he says, I'm not thinking about the midterms. You can't not, because the politics and the foreign policy have always been intertwined on this issue. But what does it say that in acknowledging, well, I could have done this an hour after the midterms were over, but I did it now, he knows he's put his party in a difficult position.
That's absolutely right. And I think his comments earlier this week during his cabinet meeting saying, I don't care about the midterms, were so incredibly telling. Now, I think defenders of the president would say that was messaging to Iran, because Iran obviously knows that there is political pressure on President Trump to reach a deal, end the war, in an effort to get prices back down. But the administration is still standing behind Trump on that. I asked Scott Bessent in the press briefing yesterday about what exactly President Trump meant by those comments. And Bessent made this, sort of this argument that he was making a statesman-like comment, that he can walk and chew gum at the same time in terms of focusing on the war, but at the same time understanding that the economy is very important and needing to reach a deal with Iran.
But does the White House buy that? When you talk to people off the record or really on background, are they buying that this is a White House that can walk and chew gum, or really that the American public wants that?
I think the question is, obviously, I think the White House is sticking behind what the messaging has been from the president on this and wanting to walk that line. I think the real question is, how are Republicans viewing this? In terms of, is President Trump really focused on this issue of bringing prices down, on affordability? We see messaging from the White House, for example, from Bessent yesterday, this promotion of the Trump Accounts Act, for example. That's a way for them to say they are focusing on affordability. But I think a lot of Republicans I've chatted with have said, even though they understand the importance of Iran not being able to access a nuclear weapon, they feel that there needs to be more relatable language on this issue of affordability.
And also maybe not the president calling it an outright Democratic hoax, like recognizing that this is something that the American public is actively grappling with at the pump, in the grocery store, across the board. The other thing that I think that we were talking about before we came on is just the sheer amount that this administration is doing. So this might be something that our viewers forgot about or tucked to the back of their mind, but a federal judge has decided not to block President Trump's controversial executive order that adds several new rules and restrictions to mail-in voting, at least for now. Instead, the judge left open the possibility for Democrats to renew their challenge of the order once it begins being implemented. The order, issued back in March, directs the administration to compile state-by-state citizenship lists, as well as use federal data to help states verify voter eligibility. It also requires the U.S. Postal Service to deliver ballots only to voters on those approved lists, and it mandates that states preserve election-related records for 5 years. The plaintiffs, which include Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, argue the order could disenfranchise millions of voters and that it violates the state's constitutional authority over elections. The judge did not rule on the legality of the order itself, emphasizing that federal agencies have not yet taken any action that would harm the plaintiffs. And of course, the president has long criticized mail-in voting, despite the fact that this is the way that he votes in many of his elections. But what does it say that the judge is now saying, you haven't harmed anyone yet? You can start implementing this.
Right. I mean, it obviously leaves the door open for the Trump administration to begin these efforts, and we could see the impacts of these efforts this year ahead of the midterms. But I think it also sets up a prolonged battle between voter rights groups and the administration and Republicans going forward.
I think what it really amounts to me, is you're watching the maps be challenged in court. You're watching the way that people vote be challenged in court. And I think it just all presents so much confusion for an American who's trying to say, hey, I'm just trying to do my civic duty and go and vote on Election Day. And I wonder if you've heard any concern about that from folks in the White House who have done a lot to tinker with or meddle with the way that Americans exercise their right to elections.
Well, I think there certainly is concern, particularly with low propensity voters. And those low propensity voters, which have been very important to President Trump's key base of support, working class voters, non-college educated voters, younger men, for example. These are all voting groups where we're seeing his approval rating really start to decline. And that's obviously a bad sign for Republicans in a midterm year where we're not going to see the same type of turnout that you see in a presidential year.
Well, because the same type of turnout and the same type of people, right? Because when you talk about the Trump-specific coalition, the question has always been, can the Republican Party writ large keep those voters when he's not on the ballot? It's why people like Susie Wiles, the White House chief of staff, have said, we're going to make him campaign like he's on the ballot, although that hasn't exactly manifested. Still some time to go before the midterms for sure, but interested to see if that travel schedule picks up. White House correspondent for The Hill, Julia Manchester, coming on to cover it all before the weekend. Thank you. Still